All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Sawicki, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's conversation, Recovering Common Goods, hosted by CAPP-USA. For those of you who may not be familiar with CAPP-USA, it is the American branch of an international Vatican-based foundation established by St. John Paul II, explicitly to promote and defend the knowledge and the practice of Catholic social teaching. In essence, the purpose of CAPP-USA is to have Catholic social teaching implemented in society, to order and throw light upon all affairs of the world in line with the teachings of Christ, especially as contained in the Church's social doctrine. If you would like to learn more about CAPP-USA and Catholic social teaching, you can visit us at www.capp-usa.org, and there you will find a number of valuable resources and explainers on how Catholic social teaching can be affected in our society. There you can also sign up for CAPP-USA's newsletter, so you'll never miss a future event like today's great conversation. Additionally, I would like to note that events like this are made possible only through the generosity of CAPP's members. If you would like to support the promotion of Catholic social teaching and events like this, you have an opportunity to do so on CAPP's website as well. I would be remiss if I didn't offer our gratitude to the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California for all of their support in promoting today's event. To them, we offer our gratitude. And now, two quick housekeeping items before I introduce and welcome today's speakers. First, we would ask that all individuals please keep themselves muted until the question and answer period at the end of today's conversation. We will have sufficient time at the end for a moderated conversation and would ask that, out of respect for our speakers and your fellow guests, that you please remain muted until that time. If you have a question during the conversation, feel free to mark it in the comments so that we can circle back to it at the end during the question and answer period. Second, I would make a special note that this event is being recorded and will be made available at a later date for all of those who might have to leave early or are unable to attend. So without further ado, today we have the pleasure of welcoming Father Patrick Riordan. Father Riordan is Senior Fellow in Political Philosophy and Catholic Social Thought at Campion Hall at Oxford University. Father Riordan, a member of the Society of Jesus since 1967, lectured for many years at Heathrow College in London. Father undertook studies in philosophy in Munich and Innsbruck, being awarded a doctorate in philosophy by the University of Innsbruck in 1985. Father Riordan has lectured on a wide range of topics, from Marxism to ethics to Catholic social teaching. And in 2021, Father Riordan was awarded the €20,000 book prize from the Fondazione Centesimus Annus pro Pontifice for his 2017 book, Recovering Common Goods. If anyone knows of someone who could use €20,000 and has published a book applying the Church's social doctrine to an issue we face today, I have it on good authority that the Fondazione is still accepting applications for the next round. And we will actually be including that information for those who may be interested in the follow-up to today's event. So to Father Riordan, we offer a hearty welcome. And as interlocutor for today's conversation, we have the delight of welcoming Dr. Stephen P. Millies, Professor of Public Theology at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago and Director of the Bernardin Center at the same. Dr. Millies received his Ph.D. from the Catholic University of America, and prior to coming to Catholic Theological Union, he was the Strom Thurmond Endowed Chair in Political Science at the University of South Carolina, Aiken. Dr. Millies is the author of multiple books and articles and speaks widely on a variety of topics. And so to Dr. Millies, in addition to Father Riordan, we offer an equally hearty welcome. And now I turn today's conversation over to him. Dr. Millies.
Well, thank you, Nick, and hello to everyone from Chicago, Illinois, and Chicago's beautiful Hyde Park neighborhood, where we here at CTU are not far away from the University of Chicago. To locate us a little bit, I'm Steve Millies, and it's a pleasure to be here with Nick, with Patrick, with you, and I'm very grateful to the Foundation for this opportunity to be in this conversation. Patrick, hello, how are you?
Hello, thank you very much. I'm very well and also delighted to be part of this very international conference.
So I'd like to open the conversation, if I can, because I am only discovering your work recently myself. I think we're here to discuss a wonderful book and a recognized one. I can't quite seem to make it appear there, but Recovering Common Goods. Could you tell us a little bit about the trajectory of your work and scholarship that brought you to this volume?
Yes, indeed. You may recall that the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, back in the 70s, made a strong commitment to the service of faith and promotion of justice as integral to the service of faith. And at that time, I was being sent to study philosophy, and I thought it would be wise to do something on the philosophy of justice. And that's what I wrote my doctorate on in '85. But when I came to teach then, I found it was wisest to be dealing with political philosophy and social ethics in a broad way rather than narrowly simply justice. And I worked at that, teaching in Dublin, first of all. And in Dublin, I produced my first book on the common good. It was more or less arguing that it is possible, or it is necessary for a liberal political philosophy to incorporate a concept of common good. As you know, the liberal tradition more or less says we can't talk about the good or goods because nobody will agree on the good. Everybody has his own or her own desires, and we can't agree on what the good is. But I countered that with a little book in 1996 on a politics of the common good. Later, when I was working in London, I wrote a book, The Grammar of the Common Good, more or less teasing out what can meaningfully be said with the language of common goods and what cannot be meaningfully said. And then a decade later, more or less, I wrote a book on global ethics and global common good, seeing the issue of the common good in the context of a developing awareness of cosmopolitanism and internationalism and so on, that we have to address problems not simply on a local national scale, but on a global international scale. Most of that work was done in dialogue with theorists in political philosophy or international relations who are not working from a basis of Catholic faith or Catholic social teaching. What I was trying to do was to represent the tradition of the intellectual heritage of the church into those conversations. So I thought it would be good to write something more addressed to a Catholic audience, showing how talk of the common good can be rooted in an understanding of scripture and in our faith tradition. And I did a little book in the Philippines, where I've also been working on and off on Philippine common goods, with that view being more explicitly faith-based and invoking scripture. And then Veritas, the publisher in Dublin, invited me to do this book, for which I got the prize. And it also is an attempt to address a particular audience, namely the Irish audience, with reference to Irish concerns, showing how talk of the common good is rooted in our faith and in our Catholic heritage. So that's more or less the trajectory of my work up to this point.
You know, as you mentioned, the challenge of talking to a Catholic audience in this time about the common good, and particularly as you set the ethos in the 1970s, in those years immediately after the council, I think you set the stage for the first thing I would like to talk about, which is a short quotation from your book that I'd like to try to address in two parts. And I'll just read the first part very briefly. It's at page 53 for those who may have the book. But now, since Pope John the 23rd and the Second Vatican Council, the meaning of the common good is given not primarily as the ultimate goal of integral fulfillment. So there you are clearly introducing something that has changed, something that is different, a different recognition that the church has made. But before we deal with the second part of that, talk a little bit, if you would, about integral fulfillment as an understanding of the common good. What did that mean? What does that mean?
Well, I think it remains true to say that the common good is God. God is goodness itself, the creator of all that is good, and all that is good by participation in goodness itself, in God. And God is the final cause. He is the ultimate end for which we are created to praise, reverence, and serve him. So that is fundamental to our Catholic worldview and to our Catholic faith. God is the common good. And integral fulfillment then is that we are brought by his grace and his mercy to see him face to face in heaven in the resurrection, or as Paul says in the second letter to the Corinthians, to see the glory of God in the face of Christ. That is the common good of all humanity. Now, people don't know that until they've heard the message of the gospel and until they've been addressed and given the invitation. But it is what God offers his creatures to achieve that ultimate fulfillment. I think when we use that language of ultimate fulfillment, of course, it's very hard to tie down exactly what that means. It is mysterious. And even the scriptures itself, themselves point to the mystery because, there is impossible to conceive all that God has wished and willed for those who love him. It exceeds all our images, all our aspirations. It will be more than anything we can possibly imagine. And that is why I think when we use language of ultimate fulfillment, we have to be programmatic, sketching out what are the dynamics that are tending in that direction, rather than being able to pin down exactly what it will mean. One of the images I use in the book, right at the beginning, is the image of a group of people, possibly at a party in a pub, who are being told a story, a funny story, a joke, and everybody is listening as if it's a good storyteller. They're listening and hearing the story being built up point by point until the punchline is delivered, and then there's an explosion of laughter. And that is a good image for common goods. It is community that is created in that moment of the story being told, and people realize something very good about themselves and their being together in that moment. They also enjoy enormously the story and its punchline. They see the point, and the point of the story is important to them, as is the gift of the one who has the ability to tell and entertain. And I use that image then also to say, this is an image for what is happening in our history. God the Father is telling us a story. That is the story of creation, the story of our human history through time. And the point of this story, the punchline, is his word, Logos, the word of God, made flesh in Christ. Christ is the point of the story. It is a happy story, as Tolkien says also in a beautiful essay about that. It is the truest of all tales. But the Holy Spirit then is the gift of that sense of humor that is needed in order to be able to enjoy the story that is a happy one, and also to enjoy the community that is engaged in the telling of the story. So ultimate fulfillment, there's an image for what it might be, but it's rooted very much in an ordinary experience. One point about this that I think also ties in with what Thomas Aquinas says about heaven. In hearing the story, we're hearing bit by bit by bit, the various elements that build up to the punchline. But in the punchline, we grasp everything together. All the bits hang together in a coherent, intelligible whole. So when people say, well, heaven, will that just be, continuously the same all the time? And of course, what we need here is to recognize the difference between the waiting to hear the point of the story step by step, and the contrast between that and grasping everything all at once. So it's a contrast, and that's what I think we can rely on to say, whatever heaven is going to be like, it's going to be more like the difference there, the contrast between grasping everything in one big insight rather than having to wait step by step to see how it all hangs together.
Yeah, I think that's really quite beautiful. And yet I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book is it is primarily preoccupied with the side of the eschaton that we are on now, where we are hearers of this story. We're not the storytellers, and these eruptions of sort of a sunesthetic understanding, kind of a shared experience of a common good, They happen, but we are not in control of when they happen, at least not very often. And that's that challenging social reality that we find ourselves in, particularly in a plural and in a modern context. And that takes us to the second part of this quotation that I wanted to ask you about. We'll remember it began with, since John the 23rd and the Second Vatican Council, the meaning of the common good is given not primarily as the ultimate goal of integral fulfillment, but you go on, but rather as the sum total of social conditions, which allow people either as groups or as individuals to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. Talk a little bit about the emergence, if you would, of this social understanding of the common good and the modern understanding of a church that's turned itself to the modern world.
Sure. I think it's very important, and the church says this itself when it makes this distinction, it's very important not to separate these two. As I said, it remains the case that God is the ultimate common good. But in dealing with social and economic and cultural and political affairs, and in dealing with the world in total today, we find we're addressing people who do not share that understanding of God as the ultimate good and do not share the vision of a vocation of all of humankind to enter into the life of God. And so in speaking to them, the church relies on a language that is more accessible to them. And it comes out of the history too of perhaps one might say the breakdown of a unified Christendom, the breakdown of a unified Christian world where people could share a common understanding that this is what history is about and this is what life is about. So while the church recognizes its role has changed in the world in contrast to the pre-Westphalian solution, for instance, she recognizes she has a double role. One is to preach the gospel, to evangelize, to announce the good news. And that is addressed to the consciences of men and women and people today in different cultures that they can accept freely. If they are moved by God's Spirit to accept the word of God, they can accept that freely. At the same time, the church sees herself as a community of faithful, I mean, not just hierarchy, obviously, but as living communities of faith. The church sees herself as partner in the world, along with other communities and other people, to build conditions that will facilitate people living in pursuit of their vocation. And that is why the church moves delicately away from assuming that everybody knows that we have an ultimate common good to saying, whatever vision we have of ultimate fulfillment, or whatever vision we have of the end goal of our lives, let's work together to make sure that we create the circumstances and the conditions that will enable people freely to pursue that ultimate good. And therefore, the discussion moves on concretely into issues of economics, of culture, education, healthcare, politics, law, and the list is endless and expanding, all the different ways in which we can collaborate with one another to make life more humane, more decent, and therefore more open to people having the opportunity freely to accept the gift of faith and to accept the invitation of God to follow Christ.
Yeah, so I think what you described there is a very challenging historical reality for the church, a very old church with a very ancient tradition and a long experience of the world, a very challenging reality, as we know, for the church to find its way through this world that has emerged, I think you say quite rightly, since the Peace of Westphalia. You identify two criteria in the book, and they track very closely with what we find also in Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World from the Second Vatican Council. Two criteria that are intended to help us identify common goods in this confusing situation we find ourselves in, where we have to both speak as believers and to non-believers in a way that is meant to be socially effective and promoting common goods. Those two criteria are first, that any proposal that systematically excludes persons or groups from a share in the enjoyment of the goods we pursue together can't claim to be for the common good, anything that systematically excludes persons or groups. And the second criteria opposes a reductionism or a selectivity, any narrow view when we account for human well-being. Can you expand a little bit and talk about those two criteria as a good way for any of us to begin thinking about how we pursue common goods in the world as faithful believing Catholics?
Right. Thank you. Very helpful. Just to remind you that I've come into this topic in political philosophy. So my main source at the level of political philosophy is Aristotle. And Aristotle, in his Politics and Ethics, spells out that whoever acts is acting for some good. They have some goal in mind that for them is good, or appears good at least. They may well be mistaken, but whoever acts for some good. And whoever is cooperating is also acting together with others for some good. So common goods are understood primarily in the context of our ordinary experience of cooperating with one another to achieve something. And we do that in all sorts of ways, spontaneously, in the way we live together, but also in the way we organize. We create clubs, we create institutions and organizations in sporting, in education, in healthcare, in all sorts of dimensions of life. We create forms of institution to enable us to cooperate, to achieve those goods that are our common goods. Now, are they our common goods? Aristotle thinks that there will be a great range of forms of cooperation for a great range of goods, and he sees these also as commensurate with different sciences. That's straightforward enough: economics, sociology, politics, cultural studies, and so on. And he does also think that there is a highest good that will be the object of the highest form of cooperation. Aristotle thinks that that highest good is achieved in politics, because he didn't have the vision that we have of God as our ultimate common good and life with God as the ultimate fulfillment of humankind that is offered freely to us. So we would not say that politics is the highest form of cooperation for the highest good. However, there is a meaning to it in that in politics, we arrange, maybe through constitutions, but we arrange the way in which other goods may and may not be pursued and how they should be coordinated with one another. And when Aristotle then reviews the kinds of constitutions that he's familiar with, and so he can think of monarchy, and he can think of tyranny, oligarchy and aristocracy and democracy, and so on. So he compares different constitutions. And he says, in some of these constitutions, there are people with power. How do they use the power they have? Do they use it for the good of all, or do they use it just for their own interests? So there's a fundamental criterion. Is power used for the common good, or is it used for the good of those who have the power, sectional interest? And that is the basis on which I elaborated then the first criterion. And it's a way not of being able to definitively identify justified common goods, but a way of excluding attempts that we have to create a good in common. And we have a criterion here for seeing when we fail or when we haven't sufficiently catered for the good of all. So various forms of nationalism, for instance, nationalist constitutions, privilege certain ethnic groups and exclude others. And that's part of what we've been learning through human history, the way in which, through discrimination, we have excluded from belonging to the political community various categories of people. And we're made aware of that with sexism, with racism, with cultural elitism. So wherever we have designed some system that has effectively, systematically excluded significant proportions of the people from a share in the goods that we pursue together, then we have to ask ourselves, are we really serving the common good here, or are we serving our own interests? And similarly, Aristotle then looks at the different constitutions, and each constitution he considers, he sees has a vision of what it would mean to live well, what is a good life. And in that good life, there's a conception of the good and a correlative conception of justice. And he compares these constitutions, and he sees some have a very narrow meaning of the good, namely, for instance, in oligarchy, wealth, the pursuit of wealth and a share in the enjoyment of wealth. That is a vision of a good, and wealth is a good, but it's a very limited and restricted good because it doesn't provide an answer to the next question. What am I going to use my wealth for? How am I going to make use of all of these assets that I have? What is the further end, the further good? So similarly, a city like Sparta exhibits great virtues of militarism, of the dignity and character of the soldier, courage. But for what are we using our courage and our discipline and so on? What is the further end? And Aristotle then, seeing these different possibilities of constitutions, recognizes a fully adequate political constitution would be, and this is his phrase, always more than simply a guarantee of rights, or simply a mutual defense pact, or simply an equality in the distribution of goods and services. It would be always more than. But he isn't able to pin down exactly what that always more than is. And this is why his thought is so useful for us Christians when we come along and we bring a faith perspective, and we know from our gospel that there is always more than on offer to us. And so we can see, okay, we can use the thought of Aristotle in order to make sense to our contemporaries, to our neighbors who may not have the same faith, but to make sense to them of what it is we're talking about. We have a vision here of a good that is always more than what can be simply available to us with temporal and material means. So I think that is the reason why the church, and maybe that quotation you bring from my book is a little bit misleading, because of course the church continues to believe that God is the ultimate good. But we are talking to our neighbors and inviting them to cooperate with us in goods that they can more easily recognize and embrace, because they are conditions and means that they will recognize for human well-being, for human flourishing, whatever the ultimate vision of the human fulfillment might be.
I'm curious to ask, just in the way of a short follow-up to your response, something that came to my mind as you were talking about that Aristotelian nobility of politics. I have thought for 9 years since the election of Pope Francis that something like that has been something he's been consciously calling us to. In that way, in Fratelli Tutti, that he calls us the co-creators of history, that way that he has written so consistently about a better kind of politics and calling us to that. And I wonder if maybe there's something in there of the resolution that you're trying to evoke here, thinking about the process of politics as something in this time that we as believers have to engage with a real respect for its nobility, for its power to achieve common goods that call us together.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm very much an admirer of Pope Francis and the Fratelli Tutti, and the way in which he's exemplified that. For instance, in his joint declaration with the Imam from Cairo, where they went to the Gulf and made this joint statement on, using the word fraternity is always a problem, like what I was saying earlier, because the word seems to exclude half of humanity, you know, but there's a historical sense in which we can see why that word was going to be used. But the being together and attempting to find common ground, even with those where there are major differences. So the Muslim world believes in one God, but not in Christ or the Blessed Trinity. So we can still struggle to find common ground, and Pope Francis has exemplified how how that might be done. And that has been quite powerful, actually, in some work I've been involved in Muslim Mindanao in the south of the Philippines, where there's been the creation of an autonomous region for Muslim Mindanao with an attempt to integrate Sharia law into the governance of that region, and how that might be made defensible and acceptable in all directions, for the wider human rights community as well as for the Muslims themselves. So Pope Francis on Fratelli Tutti, yes, I think he's one of my allies. I hope I'm supporting his work.
I think everyone here hopes that too, absolutely. I'd like to follow the Aristotelian train of thought, if I could, a little bit in a slightly different direction. At page 65, we write all the other conditions for the flourishing of individuals and groups presuppose the economic. And of course, we know from Aristotle's Politics that the art of economics is household management. It's the allocation of resources. It's making sure that everyone has what they need, which isn't necessarily an equal distribution. It's a distribution according to what's most efficient and what's necessary. When we think about modern life, and again, this different world the church is addressing itself to, modern life is different fundamentally from pre-modern life because of a wage system, because our subsistence is mediated in so many ways. And so I think for this reason, most people, I think, understand modern Catholic social teaching has been very preoccupied with the economic and with economic conditions, beginning with Rerum Novarum and continuing today. Could you talk a little bit about this pivotal characteristic of modern life that elevates economic conditions as a sort of a sine qua non of the common good?
Certainly, but I wonder if you're exaggerating slightly in thinking that we have elevated it in the modern context, because if I go back to Aristotle, in his pairing of the oikos, the household, and the polis, Hannah Arendt very helpfully makes that distinction, spelling out what Aristotle himself says, that life itself is secured in the household. Okay, obviously it's more than what we would consider as the nuclear family, a couple with 2 kids, 2 children. So the household is bigger than that in Aristotle's conception. But at the level of the household, there is the provision of what is needed for life. So securing nourishment and shelter and all the rest of it. But life itself is a precondition for the good life, which is the point of politics. Now, obviously, for Aristotle, there was only very few who could actually enjoy the good life in that full sense. But still, we're working here with operationalized ideas, so dynamic terms rather than terms that are tied down to something definite and concrete. So the provision of all that is needed for life itself as a condition for further goods, for the good life, for flourishing, for faith itself and for faith communities, that's fundamental and has always been fundamental. But you're quite right in pointing out that there are particular conditions in the modern world, especially with following the Industrial Revolution and all the modern forms of marketing and the globalization dynamic. And that is why the Church, in speaking of common goods, has paid particular attention to the condition of workers. So the dignity of work, spelled out very much by Pope Leo, and then also by John Paul II in Laborem Exercens. But again, we can see that concern with work in the context of the first criterion that we were dealing with. Are people being systematically excluded from an appropriate share in the goods that we work together to produce? And the real danger was and has been that workers can be exploited to the extent that they are made simply an instrument or a means of wealth creation, a means of production, rather than co-authors and co-creators, so people with an entitlement to a share that is commensurate with the contribution that they make and commensurate with their dignity. So there is that application of the first criterion here when the topic of work is addressed, are workers being systematically excluded? And we might have been aware in our own situations, whether it's here in Ireland or Britain or in America, the way in which trade unions have fought for the interests of workers to make sure that their concerns were adequately represented. Now, of course, our whole economy is dependent on people working in conditions that we would not accept for ourselves or for our own workers, whether it's in Pakistan or the Philippines, Sri Lanka, China, and so many other places. So here again, we have the principle of who is being excluded and how are they being excluded. But also the second criterion, what dimensions of the human good are being systematically neglected. And that is one of the great virtues of John Paul II's Laborem Exercens, is to bring out the way in which work is a sharing in the activity of the Creator. And it is part of the way in which people exercise their own responsibility and have their dignity expressed and realized. And if those dimensions of work and of workers are neglected or excluded, then there is also a failure to care for, satisfy the common good. I think, though, going back to Hannah Arendt in her, The Human Condition book, she did raise the question whether it is the case that with the predominance of economic concerns in our political discourse, there is a neglect of further, more important issues, more practical issues. And this is part of the way in which she contrasted the French Revolution and the American Revolution, much in favor of the American Revolution, of course, because it was fought in the name of freedom, rather than simply freedom from poverty. But I think one of the ways in which that question has to be answered is in terms of the distinction between state and civil society. It's inevitable that issues of economics will predominate, I think, on the political agenda. Or will be certainly strongly present, whatever about predominating. That is inevitable, because that is a forum where conflicts occur, where diversity of interests are engaging with one another and need a resolution that is political. The divergent interests between employers and workers, between capital and labor, as it's usually summarized, the diversity of interest between different sectors of the communities. And we see that coming up with the discussion about climate crisis and environmental concerns, Laudato Si, those who are vested in protecting resources for future generations, and those who are saying, hey, those problems can be solved some other time. We will now do our most, to do our best to get out of the ground or out of the economy what we can for ourselves now. So there is the possibility there too that there can be a neglect of important values in the way in which economic matters dominate. But I think in civil society, what we need is those institutions like universities, like the media, or responsible media, print media especially, where there can be an open discussion about ultimate purposes, ultimate ends, in a way that is free and open. It's one of the great complaints I have about liberal thinkers, that they have neglected John Stuart Mill's emphasis. While they take from his essay on liberty the importance of not restricting people's liberties, they then neglect to realize that and appreciate that Mill wanted freedom so that there could be frank and open discussion based on experience of our different ways of living, different forms of activity. Which of these different ways of living and activities actually contribute to fostering the interests of the human as a progressive being? So this always more than, there's always more, there's always a better, a bigger, a wider. So how have we discovered this bigger, better, wider? Through our experience. Let's have reflection on that is disciplined and open and respectful, and that can't be done in a parliament or in the Congress. That has to be done in the fora of civil society. but it can feed ultimately perhaps into law and into politics and into political debate and political adjustments and regulation. But the great neglect is that it is not happening sufficiently in our universities, for instance, or in the civil society fora where I would hope to see it happen. And largely because I fear liberal thinkers have neglected this important dimension of their own tradition.
Patrick, I'm conscious of the time, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this one last question here at this gathering, where we are here to lift up Catholic social teaching in a response in civil society as believers to these great questions that we're talking about. Can you spend just a moment before we go to our listeners for questions? Can you spend a moment talking about the ways in which the great tradition of Catholic social thinking, the dignity of work, the dignity of the human person, care for creation, and perhaps solidarity in a social sense that calls all of these together. Can you just expand for a moment on how Catholic social teaching is a way in civil society for Catholics to engage in conversations about the common good with those who don't believe as we believe?
Well, I think the strategy that I try to follow has worked for me, so I hope it may work for others as well, which is namely to begin with Aristotle's approach. Whoever is cooperating with others is cooperating for some goods in common. So let's look at where we have forms of cooperation and see where they are successful, you know, where they are achieving something that's worthwhile and being fruitful. And in finding out, say, where we've attempted to adjust our healthcare systems, for instance, where we've moved on to better ways of caring for people who have needs that we haven't sufficiently taken cognizance of before, where we have done that learning, there's a dynamic there that we can recognize fits into what it is we as Catholics are trying to achieve, namely to love our neighbor as ourselves, to love in a way that's appropriate to those who need love and care. But we are learning how to do it. We're learning how that can be done better. But that learning can also be part of what is going on in the broader human community. Now, it's where we bring our faith to bear on that. I think Benedict XVI's beautiful essay, encyclical on Caritas in Veritate, is making this very point about the instance, especially of caring professions. What difference does our faith make? Well, that's where we have to look and see from experience what difference it makes. And I'm sure those who have experienced the care of communities that are motivated by faith, genuinely attempting to live out that vocation to love their neighbor as themselves, will know what it has meant to be cared for as human persons with dignity, deserving of the best that can be made available to them, because they are our human brothers and sisters. So I don't know if I can make that any more explicit than that using that example. So following Aristotle's strategy, let's see where we are actually cooperating with people. Let's see if we identify those goods that are the goods that we share as our common goods, and then elaborate on that from our perspective, what it is that our faith contributes further to what it is we are doing. And I think there we can be silenced, of course, by the predominance of a more professionalized or secularized language to say, you know, standards of healthcare are the same for all. Yes, they should be as high as they can possibly be, but the motivation of the carer and the reason why the carer is giving the care is not part of the standards of care. And that is expressed in what is done, but it can also be expressed in how we speak about it.
Well, I want to thank you, Patrick. The book is Recovering Common Goods, and I'm trying to present it here. You can't see it, but it has this wonderful synodal cover of so many different sorts of people gathered together, holding hands. Let my voice be a stand-in for the applause of everyone who's gathered here. And thank you for this conversation. Patrick, as I turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Nick Sawicki, who's going to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Steve, and thank you, Father Riordan, for that wonderful conversation. We have a question in from James Murphy. He asks, is it the case that failure to cooperate in pursuing a specific common good could be morally wrong, a culpable failure in cases where the individual on her own would not be morally culpable for not pursuing it on her own? He makes a case in point, unbending Irish neutrality at the present time.
Oh dear, I think I'd want written notice of that question. Thank you, Seamus. I think the issue of Irish neutrality is a very good case in point, and it is one being debated at the moment in the context of, you know, the war in Europe and Ukraine and so on. I mean, Ireland has a tradition of claiming to be neutral, but it is also the case that Ireland enjoys the protection of NATO. We are under a protection umbrella from NATO, and it is the case that having the benefit of the cooperation of others, we should face the question, do we have a responsibility to share in the costs of provision of this benefit, a cost that is being borne by others? Now, obviously, Ireland's contribution with the tiny economy will be relatively small compared to the total, but the principle remains the same. Where we are benefiting from the cooperation of our neighbors, do we have a responsibility to share in the burden of providing and in the cost of providing that benefit? And my own view is, yes, we do have that responsibility. However, this is not a responsibility that can be exercised simply by individuals. I'm not going to send £10 to Brussels, to NATO, as a proportion of my tax. We need to have that institutionalized and to have some way in which that can be taken by our representatives on behalf of the community as a whole and acted upon. But that leads us into much wider and bigger debates, possibly about justified war making, justified defense, and so on. I do think, though, that there are reasonable answers that can be given to those questions, and our common goods are at stake in all of them. I hope that has answered the question somewhat.
I saw an applause from I believe Father Murphy, and so I think you've satisfied the question here. Let's see, we have one hand raised. Yes, I believe it's Bob Nalawajcik has a question. Bob, feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Father Riordan, it's Bob Nalawajcik, a member of the jury that selected your work for the award. And it's a real pleasure and a privilege to meet you now virtually and to hear your explication of the work. And also thanks to Professor Millies. Thank you very much for helping with this conversation. Going from the absolute brilliance and big picture talk, I really have a taxonomy question, which is kind of mundane. The Catechism defines the common good as a condition. The result is, as the professor said, of the result of the application of things in society. So it's a condition or a result. The compendium of the Catholic social teaching of the Church defines it as a principle. Is it a case of both and does it make a difference, do you think?
Thank you. And many thanks for, for the support on the jury. I'm delighted to meet somebody that I can finally thank. Principle is used philosophically, meaning the first in a series. And so many things that are principles, and usually four are named for Catholic social teaching: the common good, the dignity of the human person, solidarity, and subsidiarity. They are the first in a series, so we can begin with them to elaborate what they might require of us. But of course, as principles, they also have been generated out of a long tradition of reflection and of thought. They don't spring fully armed from the human mind. And so realizing why it is that these particular four principles would be, as it were, the pillars of Catholic social thought, is because we've been able to see how they shape the conditions of the life we would make together in all of those various fora of politics and economy and society and culture. Caring for the dignity of human persons, respecting solidarity among all, subsidiarity, respecting the freedoms of each and of other institutions within the order to contribute, and all for goods that are common. So I wouldn't be too worried about the way in which terms like conditions and principles and so on are used, because normally they're not being used technically. They're being used to situate the concept within a range of a discussion. Yeah, so as I say, even the notion of definition, as you'll see when I'm using Aristotle, I'm drawing attention to a dynamic, a programmatic approach to these questions, and then it is largely impossible to tie down in a definition, bringing limits, because I want to say, no, some of these notions are open-ended. They're always more than. There's more to be said. And saying something like, whoever cooperates, acts together for a good in common, for a common good, is not a definition. It is a programmatic description of what is a real part of our ordinary human experience. We cooperate with one another for various goods, and those goods are our common goods.
Thank you.
So, Father Riordan, we have a follow-up question from Father Murphy. Do common goods generally create moral obligations? I feel that you may have answered some of this, but it seems like a natural jumping-off point of where you just landed. So do you feel that common goods generally create moral obligations?
No. Common goods don't create obligations. Goods don't create obligations. So that's an awkward expression. So I'm not so sure I want to go down that road of talking about where do obligations come from. But if we just think of the things we take for granted, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not commit adultery. There are so many goods implicated there, goods of life, goods of friendship, of marital dignity, goods of property and wealth, and of truth, goods of truth. So the obligation not to destroy goods is related, obviously, to our ability to recognize goods and to acknowledge why it is that they are good. But there isn't, I suppose that's part of the meaning of good, that it is that which evokes our respect, our appreciation, our valuing of them. And associated with that response on our part is then a sense of responsibility. Well, it would be wrong to harm or destroy or damage those things. And where does that responsibility come from? Ultimately, of course, it is out of the kind of being that we are, as intelligent and free and responsible due to the nature that we have, where we recognize something as good, another person, it follows from our own recognition of that good and its reality that we have responsibilities there, at least the responsibility not to harm, not to destroy. So I recognize there's a question about how the goods and values that we espouse are related to obligations, but there is no simple deduction from one to the other, I think.
It appears, Father, do you have a follow-up question, Father Murphy? No, all good? You're muted.
Thank you for allowing me the space. I'm a great admirer of Pat's work over the years, and it has influenced and shaped my thinking. So Pat, thank you so much. I particularly appreciate your focus on the good. For most of public discourse on ethics is all about right, duties, right and wrong. And the relationship between that and goods is, of course, complex. I admired the sophistication with which you handled the difficult question just through it. One last question, please. Let's consider a group. I'm thinking of a group in the United States in the early 19th century who are working against slavery. Perhaps that the Underground Railroad, helping slaves escape from the southern states into freer states. They're working in a context in which it does not look at all like their goal is going to be successful. I know this is where faith comes in, believing in goods not yet seen. Now, here's the issue. Are they, in their work together, in their cooperation, and they're feeling we're comrades? I think it's just terrific. We have each other's back. We're working together in this. There's a fantastic sense of comradeship as we fight the good fight together. Here's the question. Is that experience, that bonding, that togetherness, that working together, is that an other common good as distinct from the common good they're collectively aiming at? Is that good achieved by them, even if the big common good goal that they're aiming at, they do not achieve it in their lifetimes?
Yes, I take the point. I think, yes, there are, something I'm working on at the moment in a different context is, again, this idea of flourishing and fulfillment. The way in which we translate eudaimonia now, or sometimes happiness, but human fulfillment, human flourishing. Is there a flourishing that is possible even if the goals we've aimed at have not been realized? And I think, yes, of course. Someone like Robert Spemann talks about the fulfilled life, the life that has been well lived. Das Gelingen eines Lebens, he says in German. When a life has been well lived, we recognize the dignity of a person who has devoted themselves to a cause and has not achieved their end goal, but their life has become an example of a good, of a beautiful good that can be narrated. So many saints, for instance, will fit into that category, won't they? And so similarly, you'll have groups of people who have pursued together a good worth pursuing and haven't achieved the end that they have pursued, but nonetheless, if they have done so well and have achieved those values of solidarity and of fidelity and of loyalty to one another and mutual support and so on, they have achieved something beautiful and good, which is a common good, but often not one that they advert to or make deliberately the goal of their activity. So that's why I distinguish sometimes between the practical and the ontological. So the violinist has the goal of producing a beautiful violin concerto or sonata in a performance, and she concentrates on the performance, on the music to be produced, but at the same time is realizing, fulfilling herself as an artist, as a person contributing to the well-being of others. But that ontological, the being more, the performing well, is not always the focus of attention. The deliberate focus of attention is on the product, on the performance as received.
Well, thank you so much, Father Riordan and Father Murphy. Thank you for your question. You know what they say, you want a great conversation, you get two Irish Jesuits together and just listen in. So that is our time for today. And so I want to offer our sincere thanks to Dr. Millies for serving as today's interlocutor, and to Father Riordan for joining us for what I think we can all agree was a fascinating conversation on Catholic social teaching and the common good. We are always delighted to be able to welcome someone who has been honored by the Fondazione in Rome, and we have been able to do that today. So gentlemen, on behalf of Dr. Frederick Fokker-Zeta, president of CAPP-USA, and all present here, you have our utmost thanks and gratitude. So thank you. If you enjoyed, well, thank you. And if you enjoyed today's conversation and would like to participate in future conversations just like it, a reminder, make sure to visit us at www.cap-usa.org and sign up for the newsletter so you never miss an opportunity to partake in one of these excellent conversations. So on behalf of CAPP-USA and our co-sponsors at the Institute for the Advanced Catholic Studies at USC, thank you to all who joined us today from around the world, and we look forward to seeing you sometime soon at a future event. Take care.